start. I always loved one of my favorite quotations from Charles Dickens. It was the best of times. You all know this probably. It's from Tale of Two Cities, where Dickens talks about the revolution in France, in Paris in 1789, and the story takes place both in Paris and London. And the opening of the book is very, very famous quotation. I'll read it to you. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. So what Dickens is talking about here, he's talking about the contradictions and the paradoxes of revolution: hope, despair, faith, cynicism, progress, destruction, creation, all elements of revolution, including the Georgian Revolution of 1917, 1918. Of course, some revolutions are worse than others in terms of their outcomes. I certainly would not have liked to have been around for the French Revolution in case I was on the wrong side. The Russian and the Chinese revolutions were enormously destructive. On the other hand, there are some revolutions like the American Revolution, the Carnation Revolution, which was the 1974 revolution in Portugal, and the Velvet Revolution, of course, in Czechoslovakia in 1989, that we might put on the good side. You know, these revolutions had actually, in many cases, some positive outcomes. And I would include the Georgian Revolution in that category. It's one of the better revolutions. Let's put it that way. So the Georgian Revolution, which led, of course, to the creation of the First Republic, was socialist, it was national, and it was liberal. It was all those things together. But before I go into that a little more deeply, I just want to talk a little bit about why I got interested in this period of Georgian history. So I was a student at the University of London, and there were three major influences. This was in the late 70s, doing my PhD or thinking about my PhD. And I had three major influences in London at that time who took me in this direction. The first was David Lang, who was a professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies. I was his student. The second was Kaki Ramishvili. Kaki Ramishvili was the son of Noe Ramishvili, who was the Minister of Interior during the First Republic, and he was living in London at that time. So he was a doctor. And the third, of course, was Shota Rustaveli. He influenced me because I actually read Night in the Panther Skin completely by accident, and I got interested in Georgia as a result. So within a year of starting my PhD in 1976 under the supervision of Peter Reddaway, within a year I was in Georgia on a British Council scholarship. I married a Georgian within 10 months. 1 year later, I was in Louisville, which is where the chateau is, where Georgians gathered for in the summer times, looking at the archives there. There I also had to get the permission of Victor Khomeriki, who was the son of Noé Khomeriki, who was the Minister of Agriculture in the First Republic. I had to get his permission to work in the Georgian archives, which were then based at Harvard. They were microfilmed archives. They'd been sent to Harvard by the Georgian community in Louisville in 1974, and Georgi Nakashidze had cataloged it. So I had to get Victor's permission. I got it. And thereafter, I traveled wherever I could to find archival materials about the First Republic. Nobody knew about the First Republic at this time. This was in 1977, 78. It was all novel territory. So I ended up in France visiting the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives, the Quai d'Orsay, wonderful materials there. I went to the Ministry of Defense in France, which France had a military mission in the First Republic, so there was a lot of material there. I went to the National Archives in the UK. The British were in the First Republic for 2 years. They had 20,000 troops stationed in Georgia. I also visited the Hoover Institution archives, which focuses on Menshevism It has the papers of Irakli Tsereteli there, who was one of the major figures of the first Russian Revolution in February 1917. And also Columbia has Leopold Haemsen's archive at the Butler Library there. So I visited all these places, collected as much information as I could. I ended up going to Georgia in 1978 when it was still part of the Soviet Union. Of course, I could not access the Georgian archives at that time, and I had to pretend about the things that I was actually studying and what I was researching. I couldn't actually tell them the truth that I was studying the First Republic. It's very different now, of course, particularly since the 100th anniversary of the First Republic in 2018, which was celebrated in Georgia with a number of publications and document collections and so on and so on. Then there is a very young and eager group of Georgian scholars based at both major universities, Tbilisi State and Ilia State, who are now working on the First Republic and have actually produced some wonderful material. So things are very different now from when I started looking at this 30 years ago. So let me just quickly go over why I think the First Republic was worth studying. Firstly, it was forgotten. This was a period in Georgian history that Georgians themselves did not know. This was in part due, of course, to the absorption of Georgia into the Soviet Union. But it was also in part to after 1991, when Georgia became independent, people weren't interested in the First Republic because it was categorized as socialist. So people weren't interested and no work essentially was done. There were a few individuals, but hardly any work. So it was forgotten. And it was very clear to me, and it still is clear to me, when you walk down the streets of Tbilisi and the urban landscape of any city in Georgia, you don't see any monuments, you don't see, well, there are a few plaques and maybe a few street names, but the presence of the founding fathers, if you like, of the First Republic, simply not there in Tbilisi or even in Lanchkhuti, where Noy Jordania came from. So it's forgotten. It's a blank page to a large extent, and it needs to be filled. Secondly, the First Republic was actually the first democratically elected social democratic government in the world. So that's quite an achievement. It's not just a footnote. It needs exploration. Thirdly, it was the first Georgian secular state. It was a republic. I mean, Georgia had been independent before that, but they were always monarchies or they were run by feudal lords. This was a modern day Georgian republic based on a constitution that was novel in 1918. One of the first things, well, not by law, but one of the first things that happened was the separation of church and state. There were some members of the Georgian intelligentsia who wanted the restoration of the monarchy, but it was decided that this, well, naturally, as the leaders were socialists, that this would be a secular state. It was also led by fascinating and essentially what I would call a rather moderate group. Although they were Marxists, they grew up as Marxists, they were moderate Marxists, who were led by Noy Jordania, and Recep, his son, is with us. So I'm very happy to have Recep with us. Who, from the very beginning, when they were young men, young Marxists, if you like, in the 1890s, when Marxism was the most popular ideology for young men and women, they were looking for a way to combine modernization of their country with equality, which was the socialist part, self-government, and also cultural self-determination. At that time, nobody was really thinking about independence. It wasn't until after the October Revolution in 1917 that really people started talking about the possibility of an independent Georgian state. Until then, and this wasn't just the Georgian Social Democrats, this was the National Democrats, the Socialist Federalists, and others were thinking that Georgia would remain in a democratic Russian republic. But after October, when the Bolsheviks took over, it was clear that that was not possible any longer. So that's what they were trying to create, this modern republic. Many of the Georgian leaders were already very famous. They had been active in the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. They had been in the state dumas in St. Petersburg, the voice of the people, and were very well known. People like Irakli Tsereteli, Carlo Chkidze, Akaki Chrenkeli, who was in both the third and the fourth dumas. So they were not just locally known Georgians; they were nationally known within Russia as a whole. They were often very great orators. You know, Georgians have that tendency to have the great ability to persuade, and indeed they were very persuasive. The word moderate, I know probably a lot of you would disagree with me using this word. The reason I use this word about their philosophy is because they were from the Menshevik wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. So they were pro-European. They looked to Western models like the German Social Democratic Party at that time, or the Austrian Social Democratic Party. They looked to those European models rather than the homegrown model of Russian populism. On which, in many ways, Bolshevism based itself. So they were coming from a different direction, I would argue. They also were heavily influenced, and this is something I talk about in the book, by Georgian intellectuals of the late 19th century, from the 1860s onwards. We call them the Teg Dalayul. People like Ilya Chavchavadze, Kaki Tsereteli, Georgi Tsereteli, Sergio Mieschi, and many others. And I would argue that they had a very significant influence on the Georgian Social Democrats and pushed them, if you like, in a pragmatic direction. So that's why I would call them moderate. Noé Jordania himself said, you know, we're not trying to create socialism in 1918. What we're trying to do is we're going to institute a minimum program, which is like a welfare state, right, a social democratic state, but we're not trying to transform the country into a socialist state immediately. This is something that's going to take time. The First Republic was also fascinating because it was an illustration of Georgia's problematic geography, something that we see today, right? So Georgia was squeezed between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and that had presented a lot of complications for Georgia as a small state. And that's something that we see repeated today. It also had a very tenuous relationship with the West, as indeed we see today, that the relationship with the West is up and down. It's getting better, let's say, but to what extent can Georgia rely on its security from the European Union or NATO? That's questionable. And it was certainly the case in 1918-21. The West really, and when I say the West, I mean France, the UK, United States, really provided minimal humanitarian aid and did not supply the arms that Georgia needed to defend itself when the Bolsheviks invaded in 1921. So they were keeping Georgia at arm's length. Also, interestingly, the United States never recognized Georgian independence de jure. They refused to do that, although France and the UK and Japan, Belgium, and other countries did so. The United States did not. And when Georgia tried to join the League of Nations in December of 1920, they were rejected. Again, one thinks of the parallels with NATO. The other problem was, and again, it parallels to today, there was none of the countries that were part of Transcaucasia, as we called it in those days, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, they could not cooperate. There were conflicts between them, in particular, of course, between Azerbaijan and Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh. But there was an inability really to cooperate and create a union that could better face its enemies as a united region, could better the economy by cooperating, and could probably get more support from the West by presenting a united face, right, of the three republics. That never happened. They did try and create a federation from April to May of 1918, but it collapsed after a month. It didn't work out. The other thing that parallels, I think, with the modern period in Georgia that the First Republic faced was internal conflicts. And of course, that's been a problem in Georgia's modern history in the late 20th century and to some degree in the 21st century. And this dragged down the Georgian Republic. It really failed, and there were lots of reasons why it failed, but they failed to integrate the national minorities into the Republic. So Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and in South Ossetia in those days we would refer to as Inner Kartli, or maybe the Tskhinvali region, they were not Soviet creations. These were also problems during the First Republic. So, when people talk about the post-Soviet legacy, yes, that was important. But these exact same problems existed between 1918 and 1921, when there were conflicts and very serious and brutal campaigns on both sides between Georgians and Abkhazians and Georgians and who today we call South Ossetians. So that was a big problem for the formation of a internally strong state, because there was so much dissension between the Georgians on the one hand and the national minorities on the other. However, there were major achievements. I'm going to just go over some of the achievements and then I'm going to stop. And all these achievements, of course, I'm going to mention with caveats, because what the Georgian government created, of course, didn't always work well because of the conditions, because of the circumstances. So corruption, for example, was a serious problem. There was hyperinflation in 1920, which threatened everybody's livelihood and also the functioning of the state. So they faced enormous obstacles to creating a stable and well-functioning republic. But having said that, there were some major achievements which I just want to quickly go through. Firstly, a new model of democracy was established. Neue Jordania wrote in 1918 a very interesting publication called Social Democracy and the Organization of Power, which was really theoretically quite innovative, where he talked about the need to create not just what he called a bourgeois republic or a parliamentary republic, but a people's republic. So the executive would be diminished in its power, and power would be shared with the people through institutions of self-government, for example, through the election of judges, through the operation of juries, and Parliament would have a preponderance of power as people's representatives over the executive. So it was a republic that was designed to go further than a parliamentary republic, and that's why they called it the Georgian Democratic Republic, the democratic being the operative word there. It established a multi-party legislature, the Constituent Assembly, which was elected in February of 1919. It was based on free elections, which was extraordinary at that time, given the conditions of civil war going on around the Republic. A multi-party legislature, everybody 20 and older was allowed to vote, and women. All women had vote equal to men. Again, this was way ahead of the United States, way ahead of France, way ahead of Switzerland, way ahead of the UK. So, it was a really progressive creation of free elections and a multi-party, not like Russia next door, which was very quickly a single-party state. A multi-party state was maintained throughout the 3 years. And the first government was actually a coalition government between National Democrats, Georgian Social Democrats, and Georgian Socialist Federalists. And I think even a Georgian Socialist Revolutionary was in the first cabinet. So a free press. Now, again, the caveat comes in, free press. Yeah, the papers were allowed to publish, But sometimes they were closed down. If, for example, they were considered, if they had said something that challenged the legitimacy of the government, they might be closed down. Nouri Ramashvili would close it down, Minister of Interior, but they would get back up again on their feet. The newspaper would change its name and it would publish again, and the government was pretty tolerant of it until it did something again. So a free press, but with caveats. Free and universal education. So up until then, it was a very hierarchical system of education, gymnasia, seminaries, and they abolished all that. They created a system that was universal and free. It did have problems, but that was definitely a progressive step. Judicial reform, they created a Senate which acted somewhat like a Supreme Court, but it was still politicized. But, that's not unexpected. But they did create this new institution. Civil society was very active during this period. The government tolerated and encouraged civil society. There were no restrictions, no cultural restrictions either on the cultural life in Georgia. Mixed economy. Now, this is a very difficult one. I'm not going to go deeply into it. It was a system essentially of market capitalism, or let's say social market. So it was a hybrid. The government often stepped in, created monopolies, but this was done mostly not from an ideological point of view, but from a practical point of view. Because, factories were closing down, factory owners were fleeing, there was no capital. So what do you do in that situation? Well, the government in many cases would nationalize the factory, take it over, and try and produce something. Right? It wasn't an ideological incentive in most cases when they did that. They also created, unfortunately, it didn't pass until 1921, but they created a liberal constitution and very liberal citizenship laws. So the citizenship laws were based on residence. They weren't based on ethnicity, blood, or anything like that. German citizenship, for example, is still somewhat based on the idea of being a German. And the Georgian government dispensed with all that. It was simply based on, have you lived in Georgia since, I think it was 1914? And if you could prove that, then you could become a citizen. It didn't matter what ethnicity you were. And also they did grant autonomy in the constitution, although it didn't work that well, but they did create autonomy for Abkhazia, for the Batumi territory, which we now call Adjara, and also Zakatala, which at that time was considered part of Georgia territory, but subsequently became part of Azerbaijan. And they created a national army, but there were problems with that national army too, and we could go into that in question time. So the state survived for 3 years. On February 11th of 1921, the Red Army invaded. The republic collapsed, essentially not because of internal problems, although they were plentiful. It collapsed because of an external invasion by the Red Army. The Georgians, unfortunately, were not well prepared for it, and we could also go into why that was the case. So in the book, I explain all this. I go into detail. Of course, the devil is in the details. But overall, I would argue this was a troubled period in Georgian history, very troubled period in Georgian history, but in many ways, it was a very heroic one as well. And I would argue that it deserves more attention. It needs to become part of the Georgian school curriculum. It is covered, but not very well. And I don't think it's given enough space or time. And most Georgians really are very ignorant about this period of their history. And as I say, I think it was really a very impressive period. I call my first chapter, I talk about the founding brothers of the Republic, who were really quite extraordinary men. There were some women too. There were 6 members of the women members of the Constituent Assembly. It was still mainly a male government there. And I would like to see, one day when I go back to Georgia, I would like to see a monument to Noé Jordania and Kaki Chrenkeli, more than these small little plaques on the streets. I would like to see some clearer acknowledgement in the public space of Georgia that this was a very important period in Georgian history, and these men were quite extraordinary, and it deserves more attention. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Oh, great! Thank you, Stephen, for that. And it reminded me in the preface, Rajab also kind of laments that when he for the first time returned to Georgia, and he's here, and then we can ask him to recall that time, that how disappointed he was that how ignorant the public was and unfamiliar with that period. And things have been improving now, and with great scholarship and work from people like you, I think we'll have there's going to be a lot more improvement. So thank you for that. So I have 2 questions that I'm going to ask, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And so a couple of instructions for that. If you have a question, put a Q in the chat. So please don't use the raise the hand button. Put Q in the chat, and then it's easier for me to keep track of that. So write Q in the chat, and then I'll keep track of that. If you have a comment, put C in the chat, and I'll call on you, and you can make a comment. But my 2 questions are: first is on the founding brothers, as you call them. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more on their and kind of ideological background. You talked about they were moderates, Marxists. Who did they read? Who were they inspired by? What was the society, the model society that they were trying to create the republic after? And the second question on this question of nationality and citizenship. Now, this is a huge issue for in Georgian history, and those of us, all of us here, know that if they were trying to create this kind of sense of civic identity, national identity. So what does it mean to be Georgian after that? So if we are saying ethnicity doesn't matter, so what was it going to be? Was it just going to be language, religion, some kind of ideological beliefs, like the way here we can be American because we believe in democracy, individualism, American creed? What was going to be the Georgian creed that replaced that ethnic-based national identity that led to so much ugliness in that time?
Okay, I'll be very brief, because I'm sure there are other questions. Their inspiration, so the founding fathers, or the founding brothers as I call them, were, they had gone through 20, 30 years of exile, imprisonment. They were quite extraordinary in that respect, right? They had suffered for their beliefs. But they looked primarily to European socialism, which was a more moderate form of socialism, let's say, than the Bolshevik version. In particular, they looked to the French socialist movement and to the German social democratic movement. They were heavily influenced by people like Karl Kautsky and Karl Renner of the Austrian Social Democrats. So Europe, I think, was really the European model of social democracy is something that they were really aiming at. That was in part due to the Menshevik context, right? Secondly, regarding citizenship, is somebody talking? I can hear somebody. Okay. So regarding citizenship, what were they looking for? I think, it was really very difficult to maintain that idea of a non-ethnic citizen. There was a tension, let's say, between, on the one hand, the idea of creating this modern secular state in which everybody could be an equal citizen, whether you were Armenian, Azerbaijani, a Kurd, or whatever it was, because that was part of the egalitarian socialist creed that they followed. On the other hand, they increasingly became aware that they were trying to create a Georgian national state, which gave priority to Georgians. So, for example, creating Georgian as a state language and making sure that everybody working in the government would communicate in Georgian, that the judicial system should be primarily in the Georgian language. These were very difficult things to achieve, and there was a lot of conflict in trying to achieve them. Georgia was in 1917 a Russian-speaking, the Tiflis, the capital, was a Russian-speaking city, right? And the Armenians dominated the economy. So it was going to be extraordinarily difficult for them to create a Georgian state, but also very difficult to create a cosmopolitan state in which every ethnicity was equal, because of the history between the different peoples and so on and so on. They tried their best, I must say, what they were really aiming for was a Georgian national state, but with full autonomy and cultural self-determination for the national minorities within the state. That was the goal.
Great, thank you. All right, let's go to questions. So I'll gonna go down the list. The first one we have is William. So when I call on your name, unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yes, Stephen, thank you. Tremendous.
Hi, Bill.
Hi, tremendous discussion and comments. What did the Europeans think of Georgia during that period? Did the Europeans come to see Georgia more as a European country at that point, or potential European country than before?
That's a very good question, and it depended. So, for example, the leaders of Western states really didn't know what to do with Georgia, or indeed with Transcaucasia. It was strategically potentially very important because of oil that was coming from Baku to Batumi and then to Western markets. It also had this fantastic railway system that would link Europe with Central Asia and the Middle East. So strategically, it had great value. But there were differences within Western leaders about how important Georgia was. In the British government, for example, Lord Curzon, who was the Foreign Secretary in 1919, was arguing that we should support Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan as a barrier to the spread of Russian Bolshevism. So we should create independent states and support them because they will prevent the expansion of Bolshevism or Russian imperialism, whatever form it took, into the Middle East, which would, of course, threaten both British and French and German interests. So that was the theory. That was the policy for a while. But there were others, like Winston Churchill, who was head of the War Office, who was saying, let's support a united Russia to defeat Bolshevism. That's what we need. We shouldn't be spending our time on these small states that, in many cases, particularly British soldiers, thought were worthless. They weren't worth supporting. They couldn't govern themselves, right? They couldn't even cooperate among themselves. So why would we support them? They certainly could not withstand Bolshevism. So there were lots of disagreements within the different leaders within the Western states. And essentially, by 1920, the British had pulled out. Well, the 20,000 troops had gone home. Lloyd George, who was then Prime Minister, was beginning to talk to Leonid Krasin, who was the commercial representative for the Soviet government, and looking for commerce with Bolshevik Russia, because it was, in some sense, much more, by that time, in British interests to do so. Georgia really became peripheral, and Europeans, I would argue, by 1920, and I pointed out that they were not supplying any aid to the Transcaucasian republics. The one exception was Armenia, and that was an American thing. The Americans were very focused, because of Wilson's support of the Armenian cause, on supporting the Armenians. But apart from that, very little aid, very little support apart from moral support. So I do see parallels today with today, in the sense that, yes, Europe is to some degree supportive of the value of independence, of self-determination, of resistance to Russia, but how far would they go to defend these small states in a crisis?
Great, thank you. Next, we have Nicholas, and if you can introduce yourself and then ask the question, that would be helpful.
Sure. Hello, my name is Nicholas Anasashvili. I work at the World Bank. I wanted to first thank you, Professor Jones, very much for what Valerian already mentioned, very important contributions to shedding light to this important period in Georgian history. Maybe my questions are a bit too specific, but I was curious about the period, about the role of women in Georgia in that period. You mentioned that they could vote, but they were not part of the government. And at the same time, I'm also curious about the religious freedom during that time, and in particular, the role of the Orthodox Christian Church, as well as the religious freedom broadly.
Okay, so to answer your first question about the role of women, in many ways, as I said, the Georgian Social Democrats were liberals and they respected the civil rights, and they, as revolutionaries, felt that there should be gender equality. But it only went to a certain level, right? So it wasn't a challenge to patriarchy or anything like that. It was just a question of giving women civil rights and voting rights. There were, when Georgia became independent in May 1918, they first had a national council before they had the elections for the Constituent Assembly in February of 1919. And there were very, very few women in that national council. Women weren't really brought into the public debate. There were active female socialists, and there was a women's section in the Social Democratic Party. But when the lists were drawn up for voting, right, the proportional representation lists, women were right down at the bottom of the list, so it was very unlikely they would get voted into the Constituent Assembly. However, 6 did make it. And Kristina Shevashidze was in the presidium of the Constituent Assembly. So she had a role to play, although, interestingly, she was classified as the junior secretary of the presidium. So even then, her status was somewhat diminished. But women were very active in civil society, even if they didn't reach the political heights. So that was an important step forward. Regarding the church, so, one of the first things that happened in Georgia was the separation of church and state. The state, however, continued to subsidize partially the Georgian Orthodox Church, but there was serious conflict. In 1919, the Georgian Church, the Orthodox Church, was accused of, or at least some of its clergy was accused of stealing goods from Gelati Cathedral, from precious artifacts from Gelati Cathedral, and selling them on the black market. And so the Georgian government decided to nationalize that property, bring it into museums. That led to a great conflict. The tensions were very high, but there was religious freedom. There's no doubt about that. That was written into the Constitution. There was no attempt to persecute the church, although the church was not, if you like, brought into the fold. You would see on occasion, Georgian church figures, for example, were there on May the 26th in, the National Assembly as participants observing. They weren't voting, but they were observing. And, many important ceremonies, church and state leaders would be there on the podium together. But it was a very tense and somewhat hostile relationship. How it would have developed, after 3 years, that's speculation. But it was not like the Bolshevik experience at all, which was suppression of church leaders and suppression of religious worship.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, next we have Ken.
Thank you, Stephen. That was terrific.
Hi, Ken.
Really enjoyed that. It was very, very good. I wanted to back up just a little bit and ask you about the role of Germany in the independence of Georgia and the other two South Caucasus states. It was clearly part of German war aims to weaken Russia, but I just was wondering how much the brothers were in touch with the Germans. I mean, was there active support? How did that all work out?
So, the Georgian Social Democrats during the war were pro-Entente. So they supported the Entente. They supported the UK, they supported France. When the Bolshevik Revolution occurred and the Russian army retreated from the front against the Ottoman Empire, the Georgians were, as it were, as indeed were the Armenians and Azerbaijanis, left in the lurch. What were they going to do? Well, the British couldn't help, the French couldn't help at this time because they were not present. They were on different fronts. But the Germans, who were the allies of the Ottomans, were present, and they could be very useful to defending Georgia from a possible Ottoman invasion, which actually did take place. So the Germans were the midwife, if you like, of Georgian independence. They intervened on the behalf of the Georgians to defend Georgian territory and, of course, Germans' own imperial interests against the Ottomans. So although the Germans and the Ottomans were allies, they were also imperial rivals. And, this rivalry was evident particularly in Transcaucasia because of the oil and because of the transit system. The Ottomans wanted it and the Germans wanted it. And the Georgians offered it to the Germans because that was a better deal for them than the Ottomans. Before the war, however, there was a group of Georgians who set up a Georgian Independence Committee in 1914. People like Mikako Tsereteli, Georgi Machabeli, I think Georgi Gvazava was also a member, who were talking already at the beginning of the war with the Germans about German sponsorship of an independent Georgia. So that was already taking place. But in the case of the Georgian Social Democrats, it was really a pragmatic move in May of survival. As Jordania himself described it, it was a question of states, of national survival. Who was going to help them? The only people who could help them at that time, who had the power to do so, were the Germans. And that's what happened.
Thanks, Stephen.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. The other Ken.
Thank you very much for doing this. William asked my question. However, I have kind of a question comment. Most Georgians today celebrate the first Independence Day over their 1991 Independence Day. What's going on there? Why is that occurring? Wishful thinking?
Well, I think there is this recognition of the legitimacy of Georgia's independence going back to May 26, 1918. And that was very important, I think, particularly for Gamsakhudia, who was trying, President Gamsakhudia in 1990-91, who was trying to justify legally why Georgia should be independent and why it had the right to be independent. And he looked back and said, well, look, in 1918, Georgia was independent. Its independence was illegally removed by the Red Army in February of 1921. That's our legacy, that's our heritage, and that is our legal justification for declaring independence in 1991. So May 26th is an important, legitimate date that recognized, if you like, the right of self-determination and the independence of Georgia in 1918. I mean, it was very important to the argument in the 1990s as to why Georgia should separate and be apart from the Soviet Union.
Very illuminating. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
The next question is in a written form, so I'm going to read it out. It says, please provide more details as to the formation of the army, the failures, and how they performed in the face of the Soviet invasion. That's from Paul.
So this is a very interesting question, and there's a lot of debate going on about it. There was a lot of debate then, and there's a lot of debate now among younger scholars about whether the Georgian government made the right decision in creating its defense forces. So the Georgian government decided to transform the Red Guard, which was a small force that represented the Tiflis Soviet, or was the armed unit, if you like, of the Tiflis Soviet. They transformed the Red Guard into what was called a People's Guard. So it was like a militia, and it was voluntary. They were not professional soldiers. And in most cases, they were supporters of the Social Democratic Party. So they might be compared to a Praetorian Guard. You know, they were loyal to the leadership. That was a problem. If you're loyal to the leadership, are you loyal to the state? And they, as I said, they were a voluntary body. They were headed by a charismatic leader. His name was Veliko Jugeli. They were not very well organized. That when there was a crisis, for example, they would call up everybody who was in the People's Guard. That meant the factories stopped working because, you know, all these volunteers had to join up and save the country, and the factories stopped. It wasn't good for the economy. On the other hand, in 1918 and 1919, the army was not organized. The Georgian army was not organized. And the People's Guard essentially saved Georgia during that crucial period of transition. They were the only really effective fighting force at that time. But the problem was the People's Guard and the army that was being created were two forces, two separate institutional forces, if you like, that were unable to cooperate in many cases in crucial situations. So General Kvinitadze, Georgi Kvinitadze, who was commander-in-chief of the Georgian army, in his memoir constantly complains about the ineffectiveness of the People's Guard, that they would desert their posts, they would go home, you know, instead of staying and fighting. They were not disciplined. They were not professional. So that was an issue. That was a very serious problem. The Georgian Social Democratic Party wanted the People's Guard because it was also a socialist idea that you would not have a professional army, but that you would have a militia, right? It would be the people's. It was not a separate professional army. But I think that in the end, really, it worked against the Georgian government because you just had this divided military force. And when the Bolsheviks invaded in February of 1921, you know, on the one hand, you had Veliko Jugeli, head of the People's Guard, doing his stuff. On the other hand, you had General Kvinitadze, head of the army, doing his stuff. And cooperation was very, very difficult and somewhat dysfunctional.
Stephen, what was the size of the forces in each?
So the Georgians would boast of, a very large military force of up to 50,000. In fact, it was about there were about 12 battalions in each. So the People's Guard had 12 battalions and the army had 12 battalions or 3 divisions. And I would say, estimate the forces between 6,000 and 8,000 altogether. And they were facing a Bolshevik army of about 20,000.
And how did they perform?
And they had multiple fronts. They had a front against the Turks. They had the front against the Bolsheviks in the east, and because the Bolsheviks by this time had Sovietized Armenia and they had Sovietized Azerbaijan. They had a front, of course, from Russia coming from the north, and also down the Abkhazian coast. So how do you divide such a small force trying to defend this country against a multi-pronged attack from the Red Army? It was practically impossible.
But did they fight?
They definitely fought. The Red Army began the invasion from Armenia on February the 11th, and the Georgian government went into exile on March the 16th from Batumi. So we're talking about a fight that lasted, so February, March. So yeah, it lasted about 6 weeks. It wasn't a walkover, but the Georgian forces were simply outnumbered.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, next we have a question from Anna.
Hello, everyone again. Thank you, Valerian and Association, for organizing this wonderful event. And thank you, Stephen, for a very interesting speech. So my question is from Georgian history school books, textbooks, which say that we understand that many European countries recognized Georgian independence in 1918, but for some reason among them, Argentina was the first one who recognized. Right. I always wondered what was the reason for Argentina being the first one. And second, I have a small comment about, like many of you mentioned, why the First Republic is not properly celebrated in Georgia. Right. So my grandfather was a history teacher in high school for 35 years. He retired in 1985. So when I was studying in like simple, regular public school history, and that was first time when we studied anything about the First Republic, I asked him if he knew those things and if he ever had questions. But he said those questions would end you up somewhere in Siberian gulag, or in a worst scenario. And the best scenario, right, you would have been thrown out of your work, deprived any welfare. So right, that's one of the, but everybody knew that it existed because many of the family members, for example, were in prison or right, fled the country. Yeah, there was memory, but they were not allowed to speak about it, especially in a classroom. That was a kiss of death. So that's, I also had that question. I asked somebody who was involved in history, teaching of history in high schools.
Right, yeah. No, you're absolutely right, Anna. It was very dangerous during the Soviet period because, well, in the 1920s, to be honest with you, I mean, a lot of my sources about the Bolsheviks' activities in Georgia in 1918-21, the Bolshevik organization was extremely weak in Georgia during that period. The only way that the Bolsheviks could take power was through the Red Army. They could not do it internally. They had no support, right? But they talked about that and admitted that in much of the discussion in the 1920s. There was a journal called Revolucijas Matiane, in which they could speak freely about what the situation really was like. That, of course, ended by the end of the 1920s, the rise of Stalin. The Georgian Republic was not either not talked about, or when it was talked about, it was condemned as an imperialist bourgeois state, right? And I had the pleasure to meet with Ushang Sidomanidze, who was a Georgian scholar in the 1970s, 1980s, who tried to write about the First Republic, and he lost his job, and it was a terrible, traumatic experience for him. So that was, even in the 70s, you tried to speak out, you would lose your job, and even if you were just trying to be a little bit honest. So yes, but my point was also, Anna, that even after independence in 1991, Georgia, the First Republic, was ignored, continued to be ignored for different reasons. Because now it was in the other camp. Now it was considered to be too left wing. And now we're going into capitalism and neoliberalism and all that. We don't want to talk about that. It's a defunct ideology, right? So that I think in part explains why it was not really explored, even when it could be explored. There was no one really interested in doing it. So as far as Argentina is concerned, I don't know the answer to that. The only thing I can think of is, South American states, in many ways, they were some of the first sort of anti-imperial states in the 19th century when they were claiming independence, and maybe they just had some sense of sympathy for Georgia that was trying to detach itself from this empire, right? As the South Americans had tried to detach themselves from the Spanish Empire. And, maybe there was some just sense of sympathy for Georgia, that was going through the same experience. But I will look into that because I don't know the answer why Argentina was one of the first, was the first actually to recognize Georgian independence.
Great. All right. Next question we have.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. From Helene.
It's Ellen. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Jones, for your time. I do have two questions. The first one is, I wonder if they identified themselves or they thought of themselves as some kind of post-colonial elites, because I do understand that they identified, they thought of themselves as Europeans or tried to be, and they were trying to be part of that Menshevik or socialist culture. They had a lot of ties, but I still wonder if they identified themselves as post-colonial groups. And if so, I always wonder what they thought about the colonies of those big powers. And my second question is, in my dissertation, I'm working on the political exile. And I would like to know if they collaborated with some Russian exiles, because we know that they tried to have some collaboration with Armenians, Azeris, and Ukrainians. But I always wonder, how they went along with the Russian exiles. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Elena, thank you very much. Did they consider themselves sort of post-colonial elites? A lot of the incentive, a lot of the ideology that they followed was infused by this idea of anti-imperialism. Okay, because that was how socialists looked at the world. They were fighting, imperial control. The difference, I think, among Georgians was, and this was different from the sort of traditional Marxist approach, right, was that they argued that in the post-imperial world that President Wilson was talking about, right, the rights of self-determination, 14 points and so on, which was a very flawed representation of what the post-colonial world would look like, because President Wilson granted independence to some small nations, but others he completely ignored, right? And Asia was just out there somewhere and was not considered. So the Georgians took Wilson seriously and argued that the post-Soviet colonial world was going to be a world of small nations. It was going to be a world in which small nations had equal rights with large nations. And that was different from the general Marxist argument at that time that the world was going to lose national borders. And the most rational and functional state system was a large state, not a small state. Small states would disappear. So the Georgians resisted that idea. And definitely, when you look at their speeches, yes, there was a very strong anti-Russian feeling, but at the same time, there were so many connections with Russia. And there were differences within Georgian social democracy about what attitudes to take towards Russia. There were some Georgians, for example, Bolsheviks, who were sympathetic to the idea of a large state. There were people like Irakli Tsereteli and Carlo Chkheidze, who were sympathetic to the ideas of the Russian Revolution, the democratic ideas of the Russian Revolution. There were others like Akaki Chkenkeli, who were more focused on Georgian independence, of national independence, of cultural realization of the Georgian people, right? So there were a lot of differences within the Social Democrats themselves. But one interesting thing, I think, is, to go back to the Georgian attitudes towards Europe, is that Russia, for Georgians in the 19th century, for people like Ilya Chavchavadze, Georgi Tsereteli and others, although they were resentful in many ways of Russian arrogance, they did see that their future was somehow connected to Russia, that Russia in some sense was a representation of Europe compared to Georgia at that time, right? It was bringing European civilization to Georgia. Under the First Republic, that attitude completely changed. And Georgian social democrats began to argue that Russia no longer belongs to Europe. Russia is now an Asian state. And they categorized Bolshevism as an Asiatic ideology, right? Because it was monopolistic, because it was monolithic, because it was anti-democratic, all these things that Georgians at that time were associating with anti-European sentiment. So, yes, they were anti-imperial, but they were also pro-European, and of course, European states were imperial states. So there were tensions and paradoxes there. For the Georgian leaders. Yeah, but it's a good question. Thank you.
Great. All right. The next one we have from Alexander.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. This was really helpful, and thank you very much for putting all the details together. My question is regarding the point you mentioned that back in the time Georgia somehow failed to build a bridge with the Western society, and they were left alone. I'm not going to ask what were the reasons. We partly covered that, but two questions. First, what exactly do you think Georgia could have done better in that sense, so to make a proper relationship with the Western societies?
Yeah.
And second would be, what do you think could be the lessons learned? Because at least to me, it seems like the history is repeating itself. So what can we learn from that? And one more thing, as you mentioned, apparently the answer cannot be that we could not have done anything, because apparently Armenia, as you mentioned, did a good relationship with US, right? So it was possible. So what do you think could have been done better?
Well, of course, it wasn't all Georgia's fault. I mean, it was also, Western powers that after the war, 1918, they wanted to bring their soldiers home. There was rebellion and revolt in their own empires, in India and in Ireland. In the case of the British, there was industrial unrest at home, strikes, workers' strikes, labor unrest. So there were things that were going on in the Western countries themselves that were drawing them away from the sort of commitments that they were not prepared to support into the future. So by 1920, when the British were pulling out, they just were saying, they just didn't want these entanglements anymore, and they wanted to get out. So it wasn't just the sort of Georgia pushing the Western powers out. It was the Western powers themselves saying, well, we've got more important things to cover and to deal with. Could Georgia have done anything better? So for the right wing, let's say, National Democrats, for example, were saying, one of the problems is you're socialists. And because you're socialists, you're frightening Western powers away. So don't continue with this socialist ideology. Become a proper sort of moderate, pro-capitalist national state. Don't monopolize. Don't introduce monopolies in industry. Don't confiscate property. Do your best to be as capitalist as Western countries, and then you would be accepted. Right. So that was one argument. The other part of it, I think, is, and I mentioned this in the talk, is that they did not I don't think, again, it was really a Georgian problem. The Georgians summoned the other republics to 3 regional conferences. So they invited the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis and actually the North Caucasians the Mountain Republic. They invited them to Tiflis 3 times to try and get some transit agreements, and some bilateral treaties were signed. But it was very difficult to get the 3 republics to cooperate. And the final straw for many Western countries was there was the peace conference in 1919, and then there were supplementary conferences in London and San Remo. And at the San Remo conference in April of 1920, what the Allies were trying to do was to get the 3 republics to cooperate, in particular over the issue of Batumi. The Armenians wanted access to Batumi, the Azerbaijanis wanted access to Batumi. The Georgians were saying, yes, you can have access, but we are the sovereign power. And so we will control Batumi. Armenians were saying, okay, but please give us railway access to Batumi, and we would own the railway part. You would own the land, but we would own the railway. So they all came together at the San Remo conference. They were supervised by the representatives of the British Foreign Office, and they could not come to an agreement on Batumi. And Chredze at that time was head of the delegation, Carlo Chredze, and he was saying, you know, we can't do this. We can't give you ownership of the railway. This is sovereign Georgian territory. So they could not come to a compromise. And the Western powers, and particularly the British, who didn't have a mandate, but they were responsible for Transcaucasia, they just threw up their hands and said, we can't deal with this anymore, because the three states are not cooperating. So in terms of what Georgia could have done, you know, without Armenians cooperating, the Armenians were not cooperating with Georgia because they were looking to America. They thought America was going to solve their problems. They didn't have to be with Georgia and Azerbaijan. So whether Georgia could have solved that problem, I don't know. But certainly if there had been greater Transcaucasian cooperation, then I think things would have been better for all 3 states.
Great. Next one, Mariam.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mariam, and I'm a graduate student at Georgetown University. I have 2 related questions for you, Dr. Jones. The first one is about the government and constitution being liberal during these times. And so I'm wondering, if the government was so liberal, why did they still fail to avoid these ethnic tensions with Abkhazians and South Ossetians? And second, I would like to know what you think. If the government had a few more years, would they resolve these issues with minorities? Thank you.
Whoops. Looks like Stephen is frozen. Uh-oh. Hopefully we'll have him back soon. Yeah, his technical difficulties sometimes unavoidable. But if someone else maybe wants to comment on the issue of minorities, or some of you who have studied that period, or could we have done better? Could the Republic have done better if it had more time with the ethnic minorities and issues of nationality? All right, any other comments about anything that we have spoken about so far while we wait for Stephen to join us back? Well, actually, why don't I plug in our next event while we are waiting for him? So we will, next time we're gonna talk about poetry, so different subject, but equally important to Georgia. So we'll be talking about this book that's been published recently on the poems of Baratashvili and Tabidze. So we'll have the author, the translator, Lynn Coffin, join us. We are still finalizing the date, but most likely in mid-September. So we'll send out an email about that, and hopefully you can join us for that. And another thing I'll say quickly, take advantage of this time, is that as some of you know, the Georgian Association was founded in 1932. So we are the oldest association in the United States. And we are looking for kind of adding to our team of board of directors, and to help us continue to increase visibility about Georgia's history, culture, identity, So if you are interested at all about joining, reply to the email from which you've been getting confirmations and reminders on this event, and we'll be glad to kind of discuss that further with you. Hopefully, Stephen is it. But any questions about the event that's coming up, or maybe the Georgian Association while we wait? I've never been.
Can I suggest, since we already have book review next time, one book like Nino Haratishvili's 8th Life?
Yes, that's a one.
Today's discussion, I think it really fits. It starts from the First Republic and ends up with the years of 2008.
A great idea, Anna. Yeah,
I'm sorry about that.
No problem. Good to have you. Thank you. Yeah, we'll consider that. But yes, Dr. Jones, welcome back.
So the storm, I have a storm going on here. Our electricity went out.
Oh no!
Yeah. So anyway, back. So so what was the question?
The first question was, if the government was so liberal, why did
they? Oh, right. Yes.
Avoid
so.
Yeah.
So it was a problem that was very similar to the problem today. I don't think most Abkhazians were Bolsheviks, but the Bolsheviks certainly exploited Abkhazian resentment against the Georgian central government. So Abkhazia became a security issue for the Georgian central government, as indeed did what we call now South Ossetia. The Bolsheviks were heavily involved. They were, by 1920, they were in the North Caucasus. They defeated Denikin, thrown out the volunteer army. And they were sending people over from North Ossetia to South Ossetia. So these were not simply national issues for the Georgian government or national minority issues. These were also security issues. Having said that, I'm not sure the Georgian government, in particular the People's Guard, dealt with these issues very well. So if there was a rebellion or a revolt in some of these non-Georgian ethnic areas, the People's Guard would go in and they would not behave very well. Djughali talks about this in his own memoir called Tyarzholi Krest, or Heavy Cross. It's written in Russian, not in Georgian, in which he himself in his diary describes what they were doing to Ossetian villages. Well, they were, as far as he was concerned, they were rebels, so they were burning the villages down. So it was a problem that Georgians were not helping themselves in terms of dealing with these resentments. And the resentments were not, in many cases, and I'm thinking about the South Ossetians and the Abkhazians, the resentments, yes, there was some in Abkhazia, it was national, but it was mostly economic. It was about not being able to sustain themselves economically. The government wasn't dealing well with hyperinflation. There was no employment, right? People were poor. They were angry. They didn't have enough land, right? So those economic resentments became political resentments. And because they became political resentments, the Bolsheviks clearly had the opportunity to step in and exploit them. And I think that was the basis of the problem. The Georgians were ideologically committed to giving them autonomy, cultural autonomy. But because of the security problem, the security issues, at the same time, they were reluctant to do that. So it was a really difficult situation for them to, in order to have to deal with that. Regarding what would have happened in the future, it's it's obviously a speculative question, but if you look at the Eastern European experience after the war, 1918, the European states in Eastern Europe, let's say Poland, right, Czechoslovakia, they were going through some of the similar things that Georgia was. But eventually, with Western aid, they stabilized their currencies and they stabilized their economies. So by mid-1920s, these newly independent states were on their feet. They weren't necessarily democratic, but they were more or less economically stable. I think Georgia could have reached a situation like that. But again, when you look at Georgia's geography, how could it in the 1930s have resisted the Soviet state? I mean, it would not have been able to, just like the Baltic republics could not, right? So the future was not rosy for Georgia in that sense. And Western powers would not have stepped in to save Georgia in the 1930s or on the eve of World War II. So eventually Georgia would have probably become part of the Soviet Union. But it would have been definitely interesting to see what sort of state would have emerged after the emergency, because everything was an emergency. There was a crisis every single day for the Georgian government during this period. What would it have been like if they had a period of stability? What sort of system would they have created? Would it have been a social democratic state? What would the economy have looked like? Would it have been a market socialist economy? How would that have worked? They really didn't, in the period of 1918-21, they didn't have time to think about that. They were just trying to survive, every day. And that's all they could do. There was no real strategic thinking. It was impossible.
Thank you.
All right, so we are getting close to the end. We have 6 more minutes, and I see 4 more questions. So I'm going to take 2 at a time, Stephen. Hopefully that helps them.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask Simon and Ken to ask their questions. So Simon, first you go, and then we'll take one from Ken, and then you can answer, Stephen.
That question came from my brother Andrew, who, and I believe it's been Ken Marbury's question. I think, Stephen, you addressed the question, whether the leaders of the 1991 independence movement argued that they were, as a legal matter, resurrected.
Right.
So I think that's moot at this point. But I do want to take the opportunity, Stephen, thank you so much. This has been fascinating.
No, thanks, Simon. Thank you.
And thank you for speculating into the future. And my question deals with that. Pure speculation, but since Georgia has been getting a much more stable government, a much more stable system year after year, what would be your speculation into the future of the country of Georgia?
You mean today?
Yeah.
Well, things are so much better than they were. I mean, I was in Georgia in the 1990s, and, it was just a terrible, terrible time, and you couldn't think of a stable future at that time. But so what Georgians have achieved has really been quite remarkable, with all the caveats that we have, about the problems. It's still the best of all the 3 South Caucasian states. And clearly the best integrated with the European Union. I would like to, obviously see Georgia move further in that direction. Of course, it doesn't necessarily depend on Georgia. But I do think, there is always this problem. Georgia is a small state. It's on the periphery of Europe. It doesn't have a significant market. It doesn't have significant resources. What sort of economic strategy should Georgia follow to establish itself, as an economically prosperous state? And by that I mean not just a state in which, let's say, one half lives well and one half doesn't live so well. I think it's a question of trying to create legitimacy and stability by spreading the prosperity among Georgians. And that's a very difficult problem to solve, partly, I think, because of the geographical position it's in, and partly because it's, as I said, a small market on the periphery of Europe. And how do you encourage that investment from Europeans when they can go to Bulgaria or Romania or Turkey? I think that's globalization was obviously very good for Georgia in some sense, but could it become the victim of globalization? could it become peripheral and somewhat isolated from, the global markets? I'm hoping that's not the case. I'm hoping that Georgia can come up with a successful economic strategy, maybe based on education and technology or tourism. But it's very difficult for a small state.
You touched on the area that I work in with Georgia a lot, and that's tourism. So my fingers are crossed also.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so we'll take a question from Ia and Nicholas. So Ia, go ahead first.
Well, thank you very much. And it's so nice to see so many dear friends and acquaintances on the screen. So good to see you all. I hope you're doing well. My question, and it's great to see you.
Thank you. Yeah. See you too.
My question to you is, you're one of the better experts of the Georgian First Republic that I've ever encountered in my life, both outside of Georgia and inside of Georgia. So you know all the things that united the country back then. And I'm sure you know things that are happening in Georgia now and the level of polarization that we're seeing in Georgia. Do you see any lessons that the current Georgian state can learn from the First Republic, something to draw on and use as a topic or as an idea to unite around, or something as a basically a foundation to try to get that state unity back again?
Right. Well, that's a very good question. What lessons could they learn? One thing I could say about the Georgian Democratic Republic was it was struggling very hard to create a participatory democracy in which there would be popular involvement in running the state. It didn't work out, partly because the state had no resources to change the economy in the direction it wanted, to stimulate the economy. And by the end of 1920, people were getting fed up by poverty and hyperinflation and all those issues. The Georgian government still had legitimacy. There's no doubt about that. And people were willing to fight for the Georgian government. But it was weaker because, and I'm not blaming the Georgian government for this, but it was weaker because there was no economic stability, and people were wondering where the next loaf of bread was going to come from. So, obviously the situation is very different today. People are doing reasonably well, although there's still very deep unemployment issues and poverty in Georgia. And what I fear that reading about Georgia and the First Republic that was beginning to happen at the end of 1920 when people were getting disillusioned with the system. There was a French high commissioner at that time in Georgia. His name was Abel Chevalier. And he was reporting back to the French Foreign Ministry that, look, Georgians now are saying, well, what about the Entente? What have they done for us, right? They're even having difficulty recognizing us de jure, right? The Bolsheviks recognized us de jure in May 1920 when there was a Russian-Georgian treaty. Maybe the Bolsheviks could, provide us with employment as well. Maybe it's not so bad, right? And I would hate to see, what I see in Georgia today, and I've talked about this in my book on contemporary Georgia, is that there is still this gap between elites and ordinary Georgians. There's a chasm, in fact, in many cases, between parliamentarians who are doing their own thing and doing well, and the majority of people who don't feel that they're part of this system. They don't feel that that there's any future, and the prospects are dim. And that is a problem that has to be solved, I think. I think it was Saakashvili himself who said, that we have to strengthen the fortress within. It's not about defending yourself with, your external borders. It's about creating legitimacy and support, enthusiastic support, if you like, for the system and for the government that you have. And that's the best way to create the opportunities, I think, for participation in the economy. But of course, it needs also change in policy. So, I mean, that I think is what is. I think there's a danger, and I think Russians can exploit that danger of this disillusion and anxiety about the future. So, I think that's something that has to be focused on.
Okay, great. We are out of time, and Nicholas has forgiven me not to ask his question, but I do want to wrap up with giving, if Rajab, the final word, with your permission, maybe Stephen, since he's the continuing connection with the Georgian Republic, and maybe Rajab, you can tell us about what your father thought of the First Republic and what you remember of him, and how he reflected on that experiment. And firstly, thank you for joining us.
Okay.
Yes.
So here I am. Well, first of all, I want to thank Stephen not only for tonight, but all his lifelong dedication and study of Georgia. It's been wonderful research, very deep. He has examined everything, and we should be all thankful for all his efforts and the efforts of many other young Georgian historians. But now I have to reflect a little bit. We are in this year of 2020. I was born in 1921, and I'm still around somehow, 98 years old of me. But I see many participants were hardly even born when the second independence came around. A lot of young people who are under 30 have never known the communist occupation, and therefore, finally, they are totally free to think, to evolve, to travel in a way that their parents, the grandparents, the great-grandparents could not do, because they were prisoners of the Soviet Union. So, what I can say also is the 30 years is the longest period in centuries that Georgia has been free and more or less together. You should remember the Russian took over about in the beginning of the 19th century for 115 years. And before that, for centuries, Georgia was split in different principalities, kingdoms. So it's the first time in a long, long time that we had this long period of being free. So it's up to you guys. Now, you do the best you can. I'm full confidence that we will continue, and that Georgia will continue forever free and independent, thanks to you. So,
thank you. Thank you so
much. Thanks, Rajab. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, all of you, for joining. Again, we'll have our next event on Georgian poetry, so look out for that email. And if you want to join us and help us do more of these events, or contribute your own way, and in ways that's meaningful to you and you care about Georgia, please reach out to us on our Georgian Association email and join us. So have a good evening, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Valeria.
Thank you.
This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It was
all right. Thanks, Ia.
We should do it more often.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
You are? Did you sign up?
Still there.
Leave. Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm removing some people. Okay.
Yes.
All right, that's it. That was pretty good attendance.
Yeah,
Usually
it was
there's
great.
a huge drop. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, can you hear us, Totme?
I think Totne is muted. He's muted. Can you unmute him? Yes.
Oops. Great. Yeah, that was good attendance. I don't know what you guys think.
I thought it was great. Wait a second. I was recording just like, I don't know if you did too, but I did just in case.
Oh, yeah.